Այլես։ Հիմա այդ երեկոյան բանը ինչ ալիները։
Հարուց չեկա, չի։ Շախոստում անասն է։ Ծարը դեպքում վերջում կտան կաննայի։ Կատան խանութի համար։
Չկնացավ։ Չէ, բարեբախտաբար չկնացավ։
Չէ։
Դրանք կա որ արդեն տբակ գերեվի որտեղ սկսած է։ Շատ աղեք։ Ուրեմն այժմ կհերարցակե չտպչիլ գերվի։
Այսպես պահելու եմ, ձեզ վերցնեմ ու ֆիքսեմ։ Անհոգ եղեք։
Նայ, մասկը սունա երեքանց կեսից, սա մոտը ուշացվել է։
Հա, ասեց, հա։
On commence. Alors, notre première présentation de cette session, c'est Haig Utidjian. Et le titre de sa présentation est Armenian Sacred Music and Miniature Painting. Some unexplored parallels and contradictions in their respective interactions with sister traditions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman.
S'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, before embarking on the main thrust of the presentation, I should first like to justify why a musician and musicologist takes a professional interest in medieval iconography at all. There are some obvious things. We have already seen two excellent presentations which acquainted us with depictions of musical instruments in medieval manuscripts. These are, of course, of very great interest and importance. But I would even more wish to emphasize those moments when iconography, music, and theology come together, interact in a very poignant manner. And in those circumstances, these respective viewpoints, namely iconography, art history, musicology and theology, can serve to shed light on each other. One very, very obvious example of this is in the course of the Divine Liturgy, when word 33, or the last sections thereof, of the Book of Lamentations of St. Gregory of Narek is recited by the celebrant from the Missal, which includes this prayer. The act is depicted very beautifully in some cases in manuscripts of the Missal, such as those two that you can see. The first one is from the Madenataran Institute in Gochat, the other one is from the Library of Congress. The music comes in as well, because whilst the bishop has fallen on his knees to recite the prayer of St. Gregory of Narek, someone sings an ode, and the ode depends on the spiritual aspect of what the celebrant is doing, because it consists of a two-part prayer, of which the first part has to be repeated an arbitrary number of times before the celebrant can proceed to the second, and the singer has to accommodate this, and he cannot tell how long it's going to take. The prayer evokes the Holy Spirit, and the terminology of the Missal rubric draws on Romans 8:26, referring to the unutterable groanings of the Holy Spirit. The prayer is addressed to the Holy Spirit. At the same time, the sung ode draws parallels between the celebrant and Aaron from the book of Exodus. And we can see manuscripts where this ode, Andrialet Naspuzov Yerchanik Subkana, is found. These are some of the oldest ones. This is the first one is the oldest one I've seen, San Lazzaro. There's one in Vienna, which is the oldest numated example. So various aspects come together in a very satisfying way. But an even more obvious area of overlap between iconography, art history, and musicology is in the case of manuscripts of the Armenian canonical hymnal. The very first study known to me, the substantial study known to me, was in fact by Sirarpie Der Nersessian in her volume Armenian Manuscripts in the Freer Gallery of Art, published in Washington in 1963, in which she primarily discusses a single manuscript copied in Abulis in Syunik in 1651-1652, but takes the opportunity of placing that manuscript in a context. Another valuable source is Father Haig Utidjian's marvelous Venice Master Catalogue, of which the fourth volume is primarily devoted to hymnals. And Father Haig, of blessed memory, was not an art historian at all, but he often makes very interesting, qualifying remarks about the artistic quality of the illuminations found in the manuscripts. Published in 1993, this is another valuable pointer. And I'm delighted to say, much more recently I discovered, and I'm grateful to my friend Anush Sarkisian for pointing us this article, an extremely comprehensive article by Lucine Sarkisian here that describes a manuscript in the Bucharest Academy Library. And though, again, it deals with a single manuscript, the author has placed the manuscript in context from various points of view, and in so doing has presented the most comprehensive treatment to date on the evolution of Armenian hymnal illumination. The fact is that only a minority of hymnal codices seem to be illuminated. I myself have had experience with a sample of 32 hymnal codices that I've been able to examine, of which only 12 were illuminated, and most had very few illuminations. But an extreme example is a marvelous manuscript kept in Vienna in the possession of the Mkhitarist fathers, pre-1675, which has no fewer than 54 full-page illuminations. Originally there was probably more like 60, but unfortunately, long before the manuscript reached the Mkhitarist fathers, needless to say, someone liked some of those images too much and cut them away, but we do have those 54, and I've endeavored to describe them very fully from a theological point of view rather than an art historical point of view in one of my recent volumes. What is very interesting is that in hymnal codices we find that because the canonical structure is followed by the artists, so we can even have, in the case of Pentecost, which has 7 days, each with its own canon, or for the Assumption of the Mother of God, which has 3 canons, we may have a different full-page illumination for each canon, and so when we have multiple illuminations appertaining to the same feast, then the artist is able to highlight different aspects of the same occasion in a very interesting way. Hymnal illuminations do have, of course, other peculiarities as well, and it would be interesting properly to address further how hymnal illuminations may differ from their counterparts, much more celebrated and far better known counterparts, found in codices such as Gospels. What are specifics? Well, most hymnal manuscripts, virtually all early hymnal manuscripts, the King Hetum II manuscript is an exception, are very diminutive in size. They're about this big, so that they were light, readily transportable, easily held in the hand. What does this imply? Well, it probably means that they were used for the purpose of instruction, reference, private devotion, maybe even solo singing, but it's difficult to imagine those tiny manuscripts serving for choral use. You cannot put them on a lectern and have even 3 people read them. So, what implications might this have from the point of view of illumination? One might be very tempted to think that when the artist has a much tinier area to deal with, then perhaps he might eschew more complex structures with different stories and various things juxtaposed against each other as we find in bigger manuscripts, although you would be surprised how much they manage to cram in tiny spaces. So I don't think we can even claim that the illuminations are in some sense minimalistic in small hymnals compared to larger codices, such as Gospels, especially lectionaries. But one idiosyncrasy that undoubtedly hymnal manuscripts have is that they can depict scenes from history later than the events described in Holy Scripture. So we find various Armenian saints, non-scriptural saints from the Universal Church, sometimes authors to whom hymns are attributed, depicted adjacent to the hymn on the facing folio. So you can find a lot of depictions of St. Gregory the Gracious, for example, whom we also found in other musical codices, manuscripts. And of course, the inevitable example that perhaps you will laugh if I show it to you because it's perhaps shown too much, it's elephants. So obviously we cannot have the Vartanans Paderasm in the Bible because it had not yet happened then. Although we can find similar things in other anthologies. There's a history anthology at the Madenataran, including Yerisher, manuscript 1920, where again we find a depiction of the Vartanans Paderasm. But there's one other intriguing aspect. It may be rather fanciful of me, but nonetheless I'd like to hint at the idea, and that's to do with neumes. Neumes undoubtedly have an immediate visual impact. One wonders if, in addition to their musical significance, a significance that was already lost to many of the scribes in later times, who nonetheless continued to copy them dutifully, albeit uncomprehendingly. One wonders if the neumes themselves may not perhaps have a certain visual aesthetic value. And if that is so, to what extent may that visual value be concomitant with the, to us, alas, unknown musical significance? Now, this is the earliest extant manuscript where we can find any ode by St. Gregory of Narek. We have Havun Artenatsial here. It's kept in this city at the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's a lovely manuscript. It's very useful to show to people who can't read Armenian, not here of course, but in other countries where there are few Armenians, because everything that is read is a neume, except for the majuscule first letter H. But if we look at a manuscript 500 years later than this book of odes, it's a Venice Talaran from the end of the 18th century. On the upper right-hand side, you see the same ode, only the beginning of it. The neumes are much more simplified, and one wonders if they're there as a sort of decorative effect. In the same manuscript, by the way, we find some very beautiful curvy floral marginal ornaments, and we know in the case of this manuscript that Zakaria Tabir of the St. Garabet monastery in Mush, he was the scribe as well as the illustrator, and my eyes tell me that the curves of the neumes are very, very similar to some of the curves of the leaves and the flowers that are depicted. And moreover, if you look at the right-hand side column, you can see that the layout on the page also has a certain shape. I suppose it must be because I'm in Paris now, but it almost reminds me of Calligramme by Guillaume Apollinaire, where again the way the text was positioned in itself was meant to create shapes. And also the dotted lines that you can see between lines in some places, they have no musical significance. Again, it is to do with visual effect. But I do not wish to overstate this case. And this, incidentally, reminds me of a fascinating presentation I'd heard just over a year ago at the Library of Congress given by our colleague Sylvie Merian, where she presented some beautiful floral ornaments in manuscripts, later manuscripts, and juxtaposed them with interior decorations of Ottoman palaces. And this brings us to the main subject of our discussion, which is interactions with neighboring traditions. The Ottoman tradition I've already mentioned. It's interesting to note that at the very same time that these things were ornamented, Armenian musical theoreticians were formulating analogies between the Armenian church modes and the classical Ottoman makams, directly adopting Ottoman terminology in an attempt to expound and explain the theory of Armenian sacred music, producing songbook manuscripts that refer to Turkish melodies as models. We can refer to the Safavid examples. We had a beautiful presentation this afternoon. Again, a year ago, Amy Landau presented some striking examples of interactions with the Safavid tradition, both in church decoration and in manuscripts. So it's not surprising that Constantinopolitan church musicians would complain that the melodies sung in Etchmiadzin were too Persian. But my own wish is to talk about Byzantine interactions. These are very well known. One extreme and very iconic example, if you forgive the pun, is this Gospels manuscript that was recently displayed at the Metropolitan Museum, where on one side we've got Armenian script, on the other side Greek writing. The Armenian donor served as a protospatarios to Emperor Basil II. It's Adrianople 1007. And the Greek tradition is one which we know quite a lot about, not least due to the fact that Der Nersessian was a very, very influential authority, and she had equal expertise in the Byzantine tradition as in the Armenian tradition. And we have not had such people in Armenian musicology, unfortunately, and those interactions with neighboring traditions are much more acknowledged in the case of iconography than they are in the case of musicology. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are really quite intrinsic difficulties. In the case of this Gospels manuscript, Edessa, 12th century in Venice, Sirarpie Der Nersessian pointed out that the letter he, the year in the beginning of Hedai looks very much like a Latin B. She was able to speculate about Counts of Edessa owning manuscripts that were illustrated. Thanks to close family ties between Latin princes and the Armenians, she mentioned various intermarriages. And that sort of thing can be done with manuscripts, because you may have a manuscript that has been given to someone as a gift. It may be kept in a scriptorium as a sort of time bomb in the best possible sense. 50, 60 years later, centuries later, people can draw inspiration from it and imitate various elements from it as they please. With music, it's not so easy, because with music, we need to cope with the inherently elusive and fleeting nature of oral interactions. Music must have been sung and heard in real time, in the air of oral actuality. It's very unlikely that an Armenian musician was able to decipher a Qualin or a Chartres manuscript and read the Gregorian neumes, or even the Paleo-Byzantine neumes, which we cannot read to this day. So they had to hear the music, and we would have to find particular instances when this happened, and that's very difficult. Also the sources. We are blessed with pairs of eyes, and we can look at a manuscript, we can admire the illumination, we can savor it, appreciate it, try to understand it. But we cannot read the medieval Armenian neumes. They are incomprehensible to us. Consequently, none of the music, sacred music that is available to us today, Armenian sacred music, is of any comparable antiquity to the medieval manuscripts of which we can enjoy, study, and compare the illuminations. The sister musical traditions are also not entirely unproblematic, though less so than the Armenian tradition. And there's perhaps one final problem, which is that music has been far more politically highly charged. For example, music has been a symbol for national identity. And so even if one were to point out that something may be influenced by Byzantine music, people do not like it. 2 years ago, when I gave a lecture about the adoption in Constantinople of a Greek melody by Armenians in Yerevan, some very senior personnel in my audience and their followers from the Madenatan Institute and the Mother Sea suddenly stood up and walked out. Then they returned when I'd finished. perhaps they had a little too much water to drink and needed to do something about it, but I don't know if it is a coincidence or not. I do hope that you will remain in your seats. So I shall present 3 concrete examples of those musical interactions, if I may. Concrete examples for which we've got documentary evidence, so it's not speculation. An Armenian source refers to a deacon called Bedros Zene, who is said to have adapted a Greek melody for the early Christian hymn Phos Ilaron, Louis Zavart in Armenian, Hail O Gladsome Light in English, known as the hymn for the lighting of the lamps. And Bedros Zene apparently liked the Greek melody and he fitted the Armenian words to the melody, or rather he adapted the Greek melody to the already existing Armenian words. I spent years on a wild goose chase trying to find an Armenian melody and a Greek melody that were remotely similar. It looked as if I would have failed, but then, when I was in Vienna, I requested that Father Simon sing me their melody. And he sang a melody to me that was quite unknown to me. When I repeated this melody to my Armenian friends in Constantinople, Father Krikor at the Church of the Holy King in Kadıköy in Constantinople, he said, well, I don't know any Armenian melody like this, but there's a Greek melody that I hear sometimes in Constantinople when we go to the Greek Good Friday liturgy, traditionally. The Armenians and the Greeks go to each other's churches, particularly when Holy Week does not coincide in the 2 calendars. And I had never heard it in a Greek church, where they invariably either recite it without music or they sing a melody by Sakellarides that is very different. The melody sounds like this. I transcribed it from Father Simon's singing. The Armenian version of Louis Zavart starts with 2 Alleluias, although we do not find this in early manuscripts. It's a later phenomenon. The Greeks start singing Phos Ilaron. Finally, the moment of truth came in the aftermath of a very pleasant dinner held in the house of a friend of mine, a Byzantine specialist, Professor Trölskal. His former PhD pupil, the Romanian Professor Maria Alexandru, at my request, she kindly sang a version of Phos Ilaron, which is not known to most Greeks, and just as I sang Alleluia, she sang Phos Ilaron, which is the same melody. So that was one mystery solved. But why is it that very few Armenian circles use this melody? Well, again, if I may, I should like to draw an analogy with Armenian manuscript illumination. Armenians have always had a penchant for ornamentation. We read in the introduction to Sirarpie Der Nersessian's book on Cilician manuscripts, although it's not her introduction, it's Anne-Marie Weil-Karl's posthumous introduction, but we hear that the most magnificently developed illuminations in Cilician manuscripts are the ornamental ones, which reflect the richness of both pattern and iconography that is unparalleled, and that has invited comparison with Armenian theological meditations. Well, exactly the same happened with Armenian melodies. We may have borrowed that melody from the Greeks, but we put our own Armenian stamp on things that we borrowed in music or which we grafted into our own tradition. There are countless examples of sophisticated illumination arising from Byzantine sources, but which became very Armenian in time. Sirarpie Der Nersessian has very many examples. The later, we find a similar phenomenon when the Armenian first books appeared and Western illuminations, Western wood blocks were used, and they inspired Armenian scribes, but then it became Armenian, that it became a hybrid, seamlessly integrated. Exactly the same happened in the Armenian case, and with this melody of Louis Zavart. There are 2 versions preserved again by the Mkhitarist fathers in San Lazzaro. I shall remind you, the melody was Alleluia, first of the two Alleluias. And so on. And the Bkhtarist fathers have an even more melismatic, ornamented version. Again, remember what the Greek melody that was adopted was Alleluia. Well, I won't even be able to finish the first Alleluia in this version that the Bkhtarist fathers to this day sing on Good Friday at Vespers. If I sang this, we would miss not only the other sessions, but dinner as well, probably. I may exaggerate a little, so I shall pass on. But it demonstrates the point. Oh, the other thing is, there's no time to demonstrate it, but technically it is demonstrable that both these melodies have been derived from the simpler one, which has been derived from the now largely forgotten Byzantine melody. And due to the excellent work by my colleague Dr. Aram Kerovpian, also based in Paris, although sadly not in Paris today, we have a very useful family tree derived partly from the Nersessian and partly from Sirarpie, and that shows us direct connections through a chain of people we know of, and we know when they lived, from Boğazene up until we get to Father Okostinos Kuyumjian, who is known to have sung this last melody, and it was transcribed by Father Revont Dayan, and it is sung to this day. My second example, as time is running inexorably, this time it's an Armenian melody that has been preserved thanks to a Greek transcription using the Greek Chrysanthine neumes. It is of the introit Jamamud sung on Eastern Day. These days we sing introits in a very quick Karozye Anagov guess motif, in an ekphonetic manner. We sing Christos Aryavi Merelots, Mavambas Makochiats, but this is a slow, through-composed melismatic melody, and I shall try to read it, just a little bit of it. Christos So Armenian is written in Greek transliteration. Christos Aryavi Merelots Machvam Imach Kochiats Yev Harutiam Bin Giurov mes isgianes parkeriats, and we don't have any other melody like this. Initially I thought, could this really be an Armenian melody? The answer is yes, and I performed it in the United States with Professor Lingas, who had discovered this manuscript and very kindly drawn it to my attention. But yes, these melodies are Armenian, and this particular melody that was transcribed by Greeks using their own notation has its antecedents in medieval Manuscripts manuscripts, such as this example kept by the Vienna Mkhitarist fathers dating to the year 1340, which includes quite a heavily numerated version, which is therefore likely to have been melismatic. Alas, this melody cannot correspond to those numerations, but it is part of the same tradition. It is the last remnant, perhaps, of the same tradition. My final example, Professor Arefshadian, of course, takes much credit for making this volume well known, thanks to her books published in Armenian and in Russian. It's Kabasakalyan's booklet on music, published in Constantinople in 1794, which is remarkable for all sorts of reasons, not least that it is the very first book in the world to print Greek neumes using movable type, as opposed to printing them as pictures. It's the Armenians who did it first. The Armenians printed the Greek neumes before the Greeks did, and they did it in Constantinople in 1794. And this is something that is found in that book. With the help of Professor Churlsgaard, we were able to decipher this, because it's not actually too difficult. It's similar to Middle Byzantine notation, but Kabasakalyan was very clever. He understood the Greek notation very well, but he needed to save money. So to minimize the number of fonts, types to be created, he simplified the system in such a way that there's minimal loss of information. And the melody is like this. And of course, with Christian's help, I was able to find at least 2 manuscripts, Byzantine manuscripts, that have very similar notation, but with some additional signs that Kabasakalyan omitted. And so it's clear that this Armenian sacred poem is a contrafactum, created to fit exactly the Greek melody, which is, it goes like this, which is identical to the Armenian. My concluding remarks are that much, as in the case of iconography, and arguably theology, although that may be something for another day, the Armenian sacred musical tradition may be seen to have been open to inspiration from neighboring traditions, especially during periods of creative vitality. It was not a sign of weakness. Armenians were sufficiently confident in their ability to embrace elements that they deemed to be attractive and useful, and they were able to imbue them with an authentically Armenian character, developing them further, elaborating on them, and integrating them seamlessly into their own tradition. No less so than in the case of miniature paintings in Armenian medieval manuscripts. I should like to proffer my thanks to Professor Yekmalyan and all the organizers, as well as to all those very kind and generous individuals and institutions who assisted me in my research. This concludes my modest presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for a very interesting and expressive presentation. Now, questions, please. Any questions?
No one left their seats?
Ես մի հատ դուք ցույց տվեցիք Նայեցիք Գափասակալյանի այդ երկնային, չէ՞, երկար։ Ինչպես եք դուք կարդացել իր այդ նոտագրությամբ։ Չէ՞ որ դա իր, այսպես ասած, ռեֆորմի արդյունքում բյուզանդականի, հայկականի եւ արևելյանի սինթեզի վրա ստեղծված մի նոր նոտագրություն է, որը թեև չարմատավորվեց, բայց որը կարևոր դեր խաղաց եւ խթան հանդիսացավ Համբարձում Լիմոնջյանի հայկական նոր նոտագրության ծննդի համար։
Շատ շնորհակալ եմ սիրելի պրոֆեսոր ձեր հարցումին համար, քանի րոպե ունի պատասխանելու համար։ Ձեր հարցումը անշուշտ շատ ավելի երկար պատասխանի արժանի է, բայց համարոդի վսեմ թե այս հադորի մեջ կարելի է զանազանել 3 տարբեր երաժշտական նոտագրության համակարգեր։ Մին խառնուրդ մնե հայկականներու եւ բյուզանդականներու միջև, ուր քերագշիր են հունականները, բայց օսհոն հայկականներ ալգան։ Նախ զուգահեռ գտվին, բայց ըստ երևույթի զուգահեռ չեն, այլ մեկը մյուսին կլրացնե եւ այդ խառն համակարգը չկարողացա վերականգնել, ի հեջուկս իմ չանուցս դակավին հույսս չեմ գտրած, բայց չկարողացա։ Երկրորդ համակարգը մեծավ մասամբ հայկական խազեր ունի, բայց հոսոն հունական խազն ալ գտվի, բայց բացահայտ է, որ այդ հայկական խազերը իրենց միջնադարյան արժեքով չեն օգտագործված։ Հոն հույս մգա այդ տնջուկը լուծելու, որովհետև հունական գդորներ կան, որոնք այդպես արձանագրված են այդ հադորի մեջ, եւ բավ է այդ հունական գդորներու միջին բյուզանդական նոտագրությամբ կամ քրիսանտյան նոտագրությամբ համապատասխանները գտնել, թեև ալիգա դժվար է, որտեղ հույներու բարակային բազում տարբերակներ ունի եւ պետք է ճիշտը գտնել։ Իսկ երրորդ համակարգը այս է, որ կրեթե հար եւ նման է միջին բյուզանդական նոտագրությամբ։ Միակ դժվարությունը այն է, որ որոշ օրենքներ խախտված են, որբեսի ավելի խնայե ինքը այդ նշանները, այդ նշանակիչները չստիպի բոլորն ալ ցուլել գալ։ Երկրորդ դժվարությունը այն է, որ թեև Կաբասակալյանը 32-յան, թեև Կաբասակալյանը շատ լավ գդիրաբեդեր այս բյուզանդական, միջին բյուզանդական համակարգին, որովհետև կարողացավ զայն ավելի խնայողական ձևով գործածել առանց իմաստի գորստյան, բայց իր դպակրիչը առանց հասկանալու դվեց, քիչմը անջարակ էր եւ սխալներ լավ, եւ երբ կճանաք վերնացել, մի քանի վերցանել, որտեղ 15 երկարյան ասած, այ որ լեզուս սազի շարժի դետալը։ Ժամանակի կորցն։ Արտացնելու իմ սխալս, որոնք հավաքնություն կհայցեմ։ Այդ սխալներուն պատճառով, երբ կճանաք հաշիվ ունեք, որ բյուզանդական, միջին բյուզանդական համակարգը հարաբերական հերավորություններու հիման է, եթե դեղմը ձեր ճամփան գործընծնեք, ամեն բան ձուր գրնայք խախտելու։ Բայց երբ հունագանը դբեց, շատ սխալներ ըրավ, երբ հայկականը դբեց, ուրիշ տեղեր սխալներ ըրավ, բայց մագաս սխալներ ըրավ։ Երբ բյուզանդական ցերակիրները գտնվեցան, կարելի է փախտadel, եւ կտեսնեք, որ այս ներկայիս այս ցույց տվածս քիչ թե շատ միջին բյուզանդական նոտագրությունն է։ Քիչ մը բարձրացված եւ սխալներով լեցում։ Բայց ընթերնելի է։ Բայց նույն քիրքի մեջի մյուս երկու համակարգերը դակավին չհաջողեցա լուծել։
Մենք երևի վերջում է, չէ, ժամանակ ունենանք, որտեղ կլոր սեղան կա, գուցե այս հարցերը ավելի մանրամասնորեն քննարկվեն։ Our next presentation will be done by David Ghazarian. The topic of his presentation is Armenian amulets in scroll at the collections of Paris.
At first, I want to say my thanks to the organizer of the conference, especially to Anna Leiloyan, and start my talk. Amailner amulets, a collection of spells among the ancient Armenian manuscripts, differ by their shape, scroll, and miniatures. They are objects